In this lesson, let's talk about using variables for environment-specific changes. And often we have subtle differences between our environments that we have to account for in the release system. Now, there are obvious items are security accounts, but there certainly can be plenty of other settings or values that we want to change from environment to environment for our release process or for the release. Now, many of our release management systems allow for variables, including secret variables, for values such as passwords. And we can change these for each environment or set them globally for the entire process, but it allows us to use the variable in multiple steps and have different values for the environment or the same value if we need that. Variables are a great way to supplement our deployment programming or scripting because we can include items that are specific to an environment or that may vary as we move from environment to environment. Keep in mind that when we program these variables into a release system, we somewhat hide their values. It's not always obvious that we have values in the release system that are being used, so we want to be careful about how dependent we are on them and make sure that everyone is aware of which variables are being used where. So let's look at a couple examples to explain the concepts. One of the most common tasks we have to do is perform a release to the database system, and we have to connect to that server to execute our code. So which database server we use, the name, the password, any other variables will be different in each environment, or at least they should. Obviously, we shouldn't have the same password in multiple environments. That's a security hole. We want to avoid that. So in one system I worked at, what we did was we actually set up a standard user, which we call DB deploy. And that was in every environment, the exact same user, but it had a different password in each environment. So our release system would use this login to connect to the database server, and it was programmed to use that name as the connection string. But the actual server name and the password were parameters that were passed into each environment. So as we went to QA, we used one password and one address. When we went to UAT, we had a slightly different address and a different password. And then when we went to production, again, a different address and different password. The process was consistent. We could copy the change from QA to UAT, and then we would just change that variable reason. We had separation for security reasons, but consistency in our process. Another example I can give is we had a table in a database that contained metadata for our application, information that would let the application function differently in different environments. One of the items was a messaging queue. And so the queue in QA was different from user acceptance, different from production. And we had to ensure that our data was synced easily as we moved code from development to production without causing problems. Now, the application uses this table for many settings, so we would move the data in the table, but we had to change the address of the queue and a few other items. So we added a script in our RM process that would read a variable. So we set a variable messaging queue URI, and then we set that to a value. And what our script would do is read the variable and then update the table with that value. And as we move to each environment, the new value would get put in the table appropriately by the release process, and it would consistently move from environment to environment. We didn't have to depend on a human changing that value. So as we got to production, it would change to the appropriate value there. Now, these two examples show that we can use variables or tokens to help inject changes specific to our environment in the release process. This is a useful way of ensuring that we have some level of consistency in our release management, and we prevent misconfiguration errors from going through the system because we're dependent on a human to actually make these changes. Now again, the downside to using these variables is that they're hidden in the process, and because we don't often check the process, we may not realize that the variables are being used. So we have to assume the process works correctly, have to make sure that people are actually typing the values of the variables correctly, and that we're examining those whenever we think we have issues. For complex environmental changes, this might not be the best way to do things. You may choose to actually script this out in your development environment, but it is one way to make things easier in the release process. Certainly, we depend on users not mistyping values in downstream configurations, so we want to make sure when we're troubleshooting, if we have any issues, that we go back and check the release process, make sure somebody hasn't mistyped the URI for one of our variables.